Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Beyond Compliance, Turning Human Rights into Business Resilience. It's great to see that we have already so many people online today. I can see that some are still joining. Let's give them a few more seconds. Basically, our goal for the next hour is to provide you with a solid overview about why human rights work should be a priority in every company. We will discuss the kind of risks and opportunities that proactive human rights work can present and some concrete viewpoints that can help guide you in building up solid due diligence processes. My name is Julie. I work in the climate change and sustainability services here at EY. I work across ESG topics and I lead the Human Rights Hub here at EY Finland. My background is in the food and agriculture industry and the chemical sector. And I have the pleasure to host this webinar with a fantastic crew of colleagues, Matlena, Ida, and Tuuli.
Hi everyone, I'm Matlena and I also work in climate change and sustainability services at EY. And my background is at healthcare and chemical sectors, and here at EY I work also across topics, but with the emphasis on human rights.
Good morning everyone and welcome on my behalf as well. My name is Ida Laaksonen. I'm a senior consultant working in the same team together with Julie, Matlena and Tuuli. I have worked a lot with various topics from CSRD to corporate sustainability due diligence and have worked with many different sectors, including, for example, the financial sector and manufacturing companies.
Good morning. My name is Tuuli Blom. I also work in the same team as the rest of us here today. And I also work with a variety of topics, for example, supply chain, sustainability, also environmental topics. And I'm also a member of the Human Rights Hub. Very nice to be here today.
Thank you. So let's look at the agenda. So during the next hour, we will focus on human rights and discuss the imperative for building solid due diligence processes. So we will start with a bit of context, basically the why of human rights and the business case for human rights work. Then we will provide a brief update about regulation, mainly CSDDD and the Forced Labor Directive, and we will present the frameworks that guide corporate human rights commitments. We will also discuss what those commitments actually require from companies. After that, we will shortly discuss risk prioritization, so basically how to adopt a risk-based approach to human rights work. And in the fourth section, we will dive into some salient human rights risks across selected sectors. Lastly, we will present some concrete actions to progress human rights work. We will discuss how human rights work is embedded in the different processes of an organization. And we will introduce how EY can support you along the journey. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A section that you should be seeing on the right side of your screen. If we have time at the end of the webinar, we can address those questions. Otherwise, if you have typed your name, we can also get back to you individually. And after the webinar, we will also share the materials with all of you. But let's start with the why. Why do human rights matter and what is the business case for prioritizing human rights work? So human rights work can and it should be seen as a strategic necessity. However, way too often human rights rank pretty low on business priorities. While their importance is acknowledged by some, the business case is frequently seen as too weak, too qualitative, too fluffy for the financial teams to commit resources. But besides being a moral imperative, human rights work and the build-up of robust due diligence processes has a positive impact on the bottom line. This has now been proven by the United Nations Development Programme and the World Benchmarking Alliance that conducted a research that spanned 5 years and involved 235 global firms. Their research found that improving corporate human rights conduct and building robust due diligence processes has a positive link to operational efficiency. So basically, the research found that companies that improved their human rights practices tend to be more efficient at generating returns from their assets. And no statistical evidence of any negative relationship between human rights improvements and either operating margins or cash flows from operations were found. So human rights risks are business risks. They're not just some abstract ethical concerns. They're the kind of risks that can directly shape a company's access to markets, capital, and talent. And they can also have great influence on supply chain stability. So to summarize, failing to manage human rights risks can have financial consequences that can be significant, sudden, and very difficult to reverse. With that, let's continue with a quote. So, while you might outsource your supply chain, your logistics, or your investments, you do not outsource your responsibility for them. It's getting harder every day to externalize environmental and social costs that your business imposes on society. This quote is from Paul Polman, the ex-CEO of Unilever and the author of the book Net Positive. To me, the essence in this quote is that a company cannot avoid accountability for neither the social nor the environmental impacts that are connected to its operations. So no matter where the impacts occur or who carries them out on its behalf, is relevant and is every company's responsibility. So acting responsibly and building solid human rights due diligence processes is good for business. And as we know, in many industries, outsourcing is routine and can involve several layers of subcontracting, from basically a primary supplier to a second, third, fourth, or even fifth subcontractor. Yet, a company remains responsible for the impacts that are created across its entire chain, regardless how far the work is subcontracted. So to summarize, companies cannot outsource their responsibilities even when they do outsource.
Thank you, Julie. In this part, we're going to walk you through the internationally recognized human rights frameworks and what is expected of companies to comply with these guidelines. We will also discuss some gaps that we often run into when working with different companies. First, we'll, however, have a look at the regulatory landscape currently. While human rights due diligence is a strategic risk management tool that can strengthen supply chains and protect business value, the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive was designed to reinforce this approach by making due diligence mandatory. In the original form, due diligence was not limited to direct suppliers, but it applied across the value chain. However, recent changes introduced through the Omnibus proposal have created significant uncertainty about the final scope and requirements of the regulation. The table presented here represents the different positions that the EU institutions have taken on the CSDDD. We're not going to go through it now in detail, but basically it outlines the stances for the CSDDD trilogue negotiations that started November 18th. On the table, you can see on the left some of the content and applicability topics that are being discussed and debated in the trilogue negotiations. These include the thresholds, scope of value chain inclusion, civil liability regime, and the inclusion of transition plans and penalties. So, for example, putting into effect a climate transition plan was included or is included in the original delegated act as a mandatory component of due diligence. The Parliament, however, has suggested to remove the requirements altogether. We are expecting the political agreement to be reached by the end of 2025. As a note, since we have also financial sector participants in the webinar, it's good to be aware that the CSDDD is also applicable for the financial institutions, but the obligations are constrained. So currently, the due diligence would be required only for the financial institution's own operations and upstream chain of activities. So this would then mean that the downstream activities, for example, investments, loans, and insurance portfolios, wouldn't be covered. It's still uncertain how this could be shaped by the omnibus and whether the original review clause of the Commission to assess more extensive due diligence obligations will be taken forward. One piece of regulation that has not gained as much attention is the EU forced labour regulation. The regulation was adopted in 2024 and will become effective in 2027, if nothing changes in between. The regulation aims to ban goods that are made with forced labour from entering or circulating in the EU market, and this would apply to all products, sectors, and companies. While the forced labour regulation does not mandate due diligence, human rights due diligence would become a critical component for risk management, helping companies avoid costly investigations and market bans. Some believe that as the CSDDD is being watered down, the forced labour regulation would take lead in driving responsible business. We also want to highlight the relevance of this regulation in the domestic context. Forced labour is not an issue that exists only somewhere far away in the global south, but it's actually a real issue also nationally here in Finland. According to the National Assistance System for Victims of Human Trafficking, forced labour is the most common form of human trafficking in Finland. The sectors represented in the cases include, for instance, the restaurant industry, construction, forestry, and cleaning. We will dive into some of these perspectives a bit later when we present some of the sectoral insights. While the implementation year, so 2027, may seem far away, it does take time to build a solid and effective human rights due diligence process. So businesses that invest early in robust due diligence processes will protect continuity, reputation, and prepare for future regulations.
Thank you, Ida. Let's then discuss a bit about the universal human rights standards and frameworks where the regulation presented below and also the work of companies should be rooted in. So here you can see the standards and frameworks can be separated in two parts. The standards include International Bill of Human Rights and Fundamental Rights and Principles at Work of ILO. These are the kind of basics that cover the human rights. The International Bill of Human Rights more on general terms, and fundamental rights and principles at work in a work context. Then we have principles and guidelines that operationalize these standards, so bring them into action. Most common one from, can you see the slides now?
No.
Can maybe one of you proceed? Thank you.
Yes.
So from here, we have UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is the most recognized framework built on 3 pillars, which is protect, respect, and remedy. Then we have OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which breaks down the duty to protect human rights into 6 principles. And then we have UN Global Compact, which focuses on promoting and respecting international human rights law. And these frameworks are not just aspirational, they influence compliance requirements like the EU taxonomy minimum safeguards. If you commit to these standards, you also need to operationalize them. And let's look at what the companies are expected to do. So what does this mean in practice? First, the human rights commitment and policy. And this is usually something that is in place when it comes to companies. So top management approval is important, but it's only the starting point. Policies must be set in place according to the commitment, and they must be communicated internally and disclosed externally for the transparency. Then the UNGP due diligence model presents a framework to cover and to identify actual and potential human rights impacts and act on findings. Companies should assess actual and potential human rights impacts, integrate and act on the findings, track the effectiveness of responses, and communicate how impacts are addressed. And all of this should be repeated regularly. In addition, the expectation is to act according to simple principle, which is avoid, prevent, and remediate. This means that companies should avoid causing adverse impacts, prevent and mitigate risks linked to operations, and remediate actual impacts when they occur. The OECD due diligence model presents a 6-step framework to act according to this principle. So it guides companies to integrate responsible business conduct in the systems, identify and assess adverse impacts, then mitigate the found adverse impacts, track the implementation of actions, and communicate how impacts are addressed. And in addition, also to cooperate. And also this should be conducted periodically. The important thing is to understand that commitment without due diligence is a gap, and if a company commits to universal standards and frameworks, they should also establish a proper due diligence model. Here is where companies often fall short, even those with strong policies based on our experience. First, the tick the box exercise. This means that policies exist, human rights commitments are embedded maybe to code of conduct, but there are no processes behind them. And this creates a false sense of compliance. Second gap is that no human rights impact assessment has been conducted. And this is critical because without human rights impact assessment, you can't identify risks or meet requirements like EU taxonomy minimum safeguards. Then third, one of the most common gaps is that human rights impact assessment is done, but it's done on an insufficient level. So sometimes assessments are too narrow and they don't address the need to avoid, prevent, or remediate. And finally, lack of periodic reviews. This means that human rights work isn't integrated into annual planning, and without reviews, risks and adverse impacts go unnoticed, and the process is not compliant with the internationally recognized standards and frameworks. To summarize this slide and the whole compliance section, international standards set the expectations, frameworks and due diligence processes operationalize them. And avoiding these common gaps ensures compliance and credibility. The important thing to remember is that if you're committing publicly, make sure you can demonstrate action. That's what stakeholders and regulators are looking for. And then let's hear a bit more about risk prioritization perspectives.
Thank you, Madlena and Ida. So let's discuss risks and the need to focus efforts where they matter most in the value chain. So in a recent Finnish human rights research that was conducted by FIPS, Fairtrade, and Threefold, a significant gap, not a very surprising one, in corporate human rights work was revealed. So human rights due diligence processes tend to be weakest deeper in the supply chain. However, the respondents of this study assessed that it is precisely at these deeper levels of the supply chain where the risks of negative human rights impacts is the most significant. So basically, this finding highlights a major misalignment. Current corporate human rights practices do not always follow the broadly recommended risk-based approach. So a risk-based approach to human rights work enables the most efficient and effective way to address both potential and actual human rights risks. It kind of helps shifting attention and resources to the areas where harm is most likely to occur. What do we need to address the so-called salient human rights issues? I think we need commitment, collaboration, courage, and some resources. So, in other words, instead of picking the so-called low-hanging fruits, the high-risk segments need to be prioritized, interventions need to be tailored, and collaboration needs to be fostered, not only with the tier 1 suppliers, but beyond. So to make human rights work really effective, companies need to adopt a risk-based approach to human rights work. In practice, so a risk-based approach, it enables companies to focus efforts where they actually matter the most. How can this kind of a risk-based approach look like in practice? How to get started with the ambition of focusing efforts where they matter most? Here are a few steps. So first, when you do conduct your human rights impact assessment, put some emphasis on the scoring and the proper prioritization of issues. Then, when you see that all impacts cannot be addressed at once, prioritize the actions. Focus first on the most severe and the most likely impacts. Only then move to the less significant ones. If you identify any harmful activities, stop them immediately. And then, as Madlena mentioned with regards to the frameworks, also here it's important to keep the prioritization ongoing because new risks may emerge. And like in DMAs, also in human rights impact assessments, severity is the key factor to prioritize. So basically, severity takes precedence over the likelihood. There are synergies that can be leveraged when doing human rights due diligence work. And us as consultants, as we support companies on different topics, we always aim to leverage synergies. So basically, we always aim to connect what has already been done and what needs to be built up. And one of the synergies can be seen between human rights impact assessments and DMAs, double materiality assessments, that many of you have been doing as part of the CSRD reporting. So basically, once a company has done a human rights impact assessment, they're in a great position to integrate the findings into their DMA. So if you have already done a human rights impact assessment, or if you are only planning to do one, it's advisable to then connect it with the DMA, maybe during the next update. In some occasions, the DMA can also inform the human rights impact assessment. This is, however, not always the case. And the challenge is that DMAs tend to be more high-level assessment than human rights impact assessments. So it's not said that a DMA can significantly inform the human rights impact assessment, but it can provide some direction. And it's good to notice that in the context of EU taxonomy, human rights impact assessment is a prerequisite for meeting the requirements of minimum social safeguards. So what we have seen during EU taxonomy assurances is that sometimes companies actually lack a human rights impact assessment. And we sometimes face the question of whether the DMA could be considered a human rights impact assessment. And the most likely answer is no. Having a DMA does not mean you have a human rights impact assessment. And personally, I have not encountered yet a DMA that would have been done at the level of depth that is required for a proper human rights impact assessment. So they're different. A few things or details worth to note is that when you think of human rights impact assessments and DMAs and the synergies, focus on the methodologies, such as the scoring of the severity and likelihood, the thresholds that have been applied, the data sources, and the stakeholder engagement. They should be consistent, or at least interoperable. And alignment is also very important. So the human rights topics that are reviewed under the DMA, they should align and clearly map to the topics that are assessed in the due diligence process. Then over to the sector-specific perspectives.
Thank you, Julie. As introduced by Julie in the beginning, we wanted to include some sectoral perspectives on this webinar to dive a bit deeper into selected sectors and what are some of the typical human rights risks and how they can evolve into business challenges. In this webinar, we have selected to have a look at the financial sector, critical minerals and materials sector, as well as sectors using seasonal workforce, and especially seasonal foreign workforce. First, we'll cover the financial sector. What kind of impacts the sector is exposed to is dependent on a number of things, like the nature of the financial institution's operations, as well as the potential portfolio and geographic location. The OECD guideline that was earlier presented by Matlena classifies the potential ways of creating human rights impact into 3 categories: causing impacts, contributing to impacts, and directly being linked to the human rights impacts. The first category, cause, occurs when a financial institution directly harms someone through its operations. For example, this could involve discrimination against the financial institution's employee. The second category, contribution, refers to situations where the company plays a role in causing the human rights impact. So it plays a role, that's the key word there. This can occur when aspects of the company's operations or processes enable creating a negative impact. For example, this could happen if a financial institution finances a project without thoroughly assessing the human rights risks associated with that project. Third way that a financial institution or a company overall could be connected to human rights impacts is through a direct link. This then occurs when the institution's operations, products, or services are tied to impact through its business relationships. For example, a financial institution that manages a company's bond issuance may have a direct link to human rights impacts if that company has been accused of human rights abuses. There is a breadth of human rights impacts that the financial institution may cause, contribute to, or be linked to. But here are some examples that are common and that have been recently reported, for instance, under the CSRD. In the financial institution's own operations, meaning, for example, the company's own workforce and management, some potential impacts include labor right violations, such as diversity imbalance, which is often seen in the industry. Privacy and data protection breaches are also highly relevant as financial institutions manage accounts and personal information. Money laundering is another issue that frequently arises in the sector. For example, in EY's CSRD benchmark, 86% of the analyzed financial institutions deemed financial crime as a material topic. And then financial institutions can cause, contribute to, or directly impact or be directly linked to value chain actors through their customers and investees, for example. This could involve a financing project that negatively affect local communities, discrimination in loan approval processes, even when driven by, for example, unconscious bias, as well as holding shares in companies that are involved in human rights violations. And these violations can vary widely depending on the types of companies that the financial institution chooses to finance. Next, we'll move to the critical minerals and materials sector.
Thank you, Ida, for the very interesting insights regarding the financial sector. So now let's look at the critical minerals and materials sector, and specifically focusing on the green transition and the increasing need for these so-called transition minerals. So Technologies that are needed for decarbonization and digitalization, such as solar panels, for example, or wind turbines, or electric vehicle batteries and data centers, they depend on significant amounts of minerals. And these transition minerals are naturally occurring materials that are essential for these renewable technologies. The demand for minerals is estimated to increase very sharply. And for example, lithium and nickel and cobalt, for example, are used in powering electric vehicles, and rare earth elements are critical also for the magnets used in wind turbines and electric motors. And copper and aluminium are required in large amounts for power transmission infrastructure. So the need for all of these raw materials, amongst others, is driving higher levels of extraction globally. And as many of us are well aware of, raw material extraction is associated with well-known human rights risks. And due to the increase in the need of raw materials, human rights risks today are as present as ever. So the human rights risks also extend to Finnish companies due to the global supply chains, meaning that domestic companies are not immune to these adverse impacts. For example, the EU Commission has stated that 63% of the world's cobalt is extracted from Congo, and 71% of the EU's needs for platinum group metals is provided by South Africa, and as much as 100% so all of the rare earth elements, specifically magnets used in wind turbine motors, are refined in China. And therefore, companies would need to ensure robust human rights practices also in their supply chains. However, we should also note that Finland is a significant supplier of critical raw materials in the EU, and our role is only expected to grow. For example, the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act aims at increasing EU's own raw material extraction, and currently 16 mining projects located in Finland have also applied for this kind of strategic project status under the Raw Materials Act, which also implies an increase in the mining activities. From a human rights perspective, here also in Finland and the Nordics, especially the rights of indigenous peoples should be kept in mind. Some mines have been planned on or nearby the lands of the indigenous Sami communities, who are also facing multiple simultaneous land use pressures, for example, due to mining and renewable energy and other infrastructure projects. And the Sami, who have already had to fight for their rights for a long time, have expressed their concern. And for example, the Sami Council is concerned that the EU's push for mineral extraction may lead to human rights violations and the further marginalization of Sami communities, especially in terms of self-determination regarding land use rights. So while a lot is, of course, depending on the regulation and the public sector, this is something that companies in the sector would need to consider so that the transition to a greener economy would not mean neglecting indigenous people's human rights. Here in the right, we have listed some of the most salient issues persistent in the sector. And these risks are, of course, evident in the global value chains of transition minerals, but also in Finland and more broader in the Nordic region. And in, for example, environmental impacts related to mining may also negatively impact human rights, for example, because of water pollution. And other impacts like the lack of public participation may also arise if decision-making processes do not sufficiently consider, for example, local communities, including the Sami. So it should really be thought about how, for example, local consultations could be organized in an inclusive way. So to summarize, the efforts regarding the green transition and moving towards a more climate neutral economy also requires focus and effort in terms of human rights work. But now, thank you, and I will hand over to Matlena, who will talk about seasonal and foreign workforce.
Thank you, Tuuli. Yeah. So now it's time for our last sector perspective of today, and we will talk about multiple sectors actually, that are using seasonal foreign workforce. We all probably know that Finland relies heavily on seasonal foreign workers to fill labor shortages in certain key industries. This reliance also carries responsibility, which means that the rights of the seasonal foreign workforce must be prioritized. In recent years, there has been public discussion in the media about human rights concerns in these sectors, which make the topic even more relevant. So seasonal workers are critical for sectors like agriculture, forestry, tourism, and construction. And without them, many businesses would struggle to operate during peak seasons. This dependency makes it even more important to ensure fair and safe working conditions. However, these workers often find themselves in vulnerable positions. They have limited opportunities to raise issues or seek support. Language barriers make communication difficult, and discrimination or regulatory gaps can leave them exposed. These factors increase the risks of human rights violations. From a business perspective, ignoring these risks isn't just unethical, it's costly. Companies can face legal consequences, reputational damage, and workforce instability. Regulators and stakeholders are paying attention, and failure to act can have serious implications. And finally, continuity and growth are dependent on addressing these issues. If seasonal workers feel unsafe or exploited, retention drops and productivity suffers, and the entire supply chain can be disrupted. Protecting rights is not only the right thing to do, it also makes sense from a business perspective. Now let's look at the most common human rights issues in industries that rely heavily on seasonal workers. First, extended working hours and insufficient rest periods, which means that workers often face exhausting schedules and very limited free time. Then they might receive insufficient onboarding, and they might have limited awareness of their rights. So many don't know rights they have, and insufficient onboarding in turn might create safety risks for themselves, but also in end users in case of services. Then seasonal foreign workforce tend to have limited influence on working conditions, and there are not channels to raise issues. On top of that, language barriers make it difficult to communicate concerns, and all in all, many workers simply don't know where to seek help or what support services are available. Then low wages and indebtedness is unfortunately common, and sometimes these are linked to recruitment fees or unfair deductions. Then seasonal workforce tend to be dependent on employer or subcontractors or contractors, and this creates power imbalances. In extreme cases, also forced labor exists also here in Finland, and workers can be trapped in exploitative conditions. And lastly, inhumane living conditions, which means that the housing or living conditions arranged for seasonal foreign workforce can mean crowded housing or lack of privacy. These all are priority areas that companies should be aware of and manage proactively to reduce risks and ensure fair treatment of workers. To sum up, seasonal foreign workers are essential for Finland and key industries, but their vulnerability means companies must take steps to protect their rights. This is both compliance requirement and also business necessity. And then we will step towards more concrete actions, and I'll hand it back to Tuuli.
Thank you, Matlena. So yes, let's now look at the concrete actions and what human rights work may actually look like in practice. As already mentioned earlier, the global frameworks such as the OECD and UNGP are used as reference when designing due diligence processes. And this picture here of the OECD process is probably familiar to many of you already. In practice, designing this kind of DD process along the lines of this due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct ensures that the process follows this core steps, 6 steps altogether, where first is integrating responsible business conduct into policies and management systems. And the next steps are a bit more practical. So first identifying and assessing the impacts, then seizing or preventing or mitigating the adverse impacts, then tracking the implementation and results of these mitigation efforts, then also communicating how the impacts are addressed, and finally providing or cooperating in remediation. Overall, the purpose of these principles is to avoid causing or contributing to harm and to address risks linked to operations or products or services through business relationships. And central to the framework is to implement the risk-based approach, which Julie also talked about earlier. So to actually focus on the most severe and likely adverse impacts and to then act on them. And this is also a continuous process and not a one-time kind of a tick the box exercise. And this is also not something that a company should do alone, meaning that affected stakeholders and partners should be involved in identifying and addressing these risks and working towards mitigating them in cooperation. Because as we know, it's very difficult to gain visibility further down the value chain without stakeholder dialogue and cooperation with suppliers, for example. And it is also worth to note that a DD process that is built along these lines and core principles supports also the fulfillment of the requirements of EU taxonomy and the CSRD and the CSDDD. So they are all connected. Now, let's look shortly at what these elements of due diligence process may look like in practice. So here's a long list of concrete examples of how this implementation could mean in practice, but just to name a few. So for example, the human rights impact assessment that has already been mentioned, it is critical in gaining an understanding of the actual and potential impacts that may occur in the supply chain. And the impact assessment is also a requirement for fulfilling the EU taxonomy minimum social safeguards. And the human rights impact assessment should also be updated regularly to understand any new risks, or also if, for example, the scope of the company's operations change. And last but not least, the mitigation and remediation process is very important in demonstrating actual commitment to act on any identified adverse impacts, and to also demonstrate a concrete commitment to action for stakeholders. But now let's hear from Julie about why human rights work should be broadly integrated into the business strategy.
Thank you, Tuuli. So human rights, they should not be seen as a standalone responsibility of the compliance or sustainability teams. Instead, the strategic integration of human rights into core processes can enable value creation and enhance long-term resilience. So the integration of human rights into core processes is basically a lever to gain strategic advantage. So integrate the human rights into core processes to gain strategic advantage. Let's start with that one. So human rights should be a key consideration when entering new markets or launching new product categories. So if during your endeavor to expand, you identify some potential human rights risks, for instance, labor abuses or some supply chain challenges, you're in a good position to still shape your market entry strategy and implement mitigation measures to reduce legal, operational, and reputational risks. Then when human rights are a key consideration in procurement and supplier relationship management, they actually support building resilient, reliable, and compliant supply chains. So building greater supplier visibility can help mitigate risks, such as, for instance, forced labor or unsafe working conditions. And the early identification of risks then prevents supply chain disruptions. Then, when doing investments, companies that proactively do human rights due diligence can prevent legacy risks, protect value, and support their long-term growth. So basically, robust due diligence procedures can help the identification of any legacy liabilities, gaps in processes, or such that could create future risks. Due diligence also helps to ensure that the target or the investment meets the investors' human rights expectations. Then including priority human rights risks into enterprise risk management frameworks strengthens corporate risk management. So a comprehensive approach, one that does not overlook ESG risks, can help reduce disruptions across both own business operations and the supply chain. And then the integration of human rights to human resources management reinforces fair, safe, and inclusive workforce practices. And this is pretty essential to safeguard that recruitment, training, and workplace policies prevent discrimination, protect health and safety, and promote diversity and inclusion. And then last but not least, being an active force driving human rights advancements can trigger positive change across the value chain. So building responsible practices across the chain can bring strategic business benefits for instance, when transactional kind of vendor type relationships shift towards long-term trust-based partnerships, and when the visibility improves as well. So basically, to summarize this, human rights are a shared responsibility, and ideally they should be embedded in the processes across the organization. Last, not least, we're here to support you on your journey, building your human rights related ambitions, processes, targets, and creating impact. So our team at EY works across sectors, and we have, for instance, as you can see here on the slide, helped customers conducting their human rights impact assessments. We can also support developing due diligence processes or supplier management strategies, for instance. We also do due diligence assessments for the financial sector, or for instance, before M&As or joint ventures. And we can also help developing or drafting policies, such as code of conducts, that are then aligned with the global human rights declarations and principles that we discussed earlier. And basically, whatever we do, we do tailor it to the needs of you, the customer, so that you can then have the right insights, the right processes, tools, guidance, and documentation to meet your human rights ambition and create positive impact. With that, we want to thank you for your time and for joining us today. We will provide you with the materials, so you will hear from us. And I don't think we have any questions in the Q&A section. But in case you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to discuss human rights and help you along the journey. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your week.